If there's one thing my time in Fallout 4 taught me, it's that war never changes. And that was true for thousands of years. Hundreds to tens of thousands of people would cluster together in tight formations and meet the enemy at a strategic location. With a blast of trumpets and crescendo of drums, the killing ceremony would begin. Up until the medieval era, war could be seen as a showdown between clusters. In fact, you could just represent most conflicts as a collection of points on a map, which is why things like individual skill mattered a lot. Experienced, elite warriors could have absolutely broken KD ratios, generals would duke it out between themselves in epic battles, and even kings would heroically lead the charge at the front. Those were the good old days when glory actually meant something. Gunpowder took the honor out of war. The barrier to entry to killing the enemy was demolished to the point where pretty much anyone could kill an enemy if they could pull a trigger from far away. With industrialization and drastically increased mobilization capabilities, war mutated into something ugly. No longer was war a battle between points, it was a battlefield of moving lines. Because a stray bullet can, one-shot even the strongest man, death-averse soldiers started to dig holes in the ground to start the tradition literally everyone hates: trench warfare. The invention of the gun and cannon didn't change the battlefield overnight. The primitive guns and cannons of the medieval era had shit accuracy and took minutes to reload. Because gunpowder and bullets were so expensive, only elite soldiers who made their bones could be gunners. They would be escorted by spearmen to shoot around and then fuck off for a bit to reload, or take turns shooting in volleys to keep up DPS. Guns and cannons got better with time, and with the invention of the bayonet, well, the gunners could do their own stabbing, so everyone started carrying guns. Sure, that sounds good in theory, but promoting everyday peasants to gunners meant that everyone, on average, was shit at aiming. So might as well line them up and shoot in salvos so they at least hit something. Guns were no longer used to chip away at the enemy with consistent DPS. Guns now meant massive fucking AoE damage. It wasn't just the gun that saw massive leaps. Countries got better at bureaucracy, which meant that they could draft entire populations and zip them around with trains. Communication technology faster than, a man on a horse meant that these massive armies at different locations could perform massive missions simultaneously. War was no longer decided with a single epic battle. No, war meant that numerous battlefields were connected to each other through fluid front lines. This new, ugly type of war was first shown during the American Civil War in the 19th century. You had to hold the line or break the enemy lines, a consistent drag of push and pull. The era of the boring war is here. The Gatling gun was invented during the American Civil War and changed everything. It could fire up to 200 rounds a minute, which was completely unheard of at the time. The inventor, Richard Gatling, thought that his invention would end all human wars permanently if he could give a single man the power to mow down hundreds. He dreamed that his invention would render armies useless and countries would be forced to handle their issues in a non-violent manner. Oh boy, was he wrong. At the end of the 19th century, the Maxim gun was invented in Britain, a lighter, even more powerful machine gun. And you can probably see where this is going. The European powers went to places like Africa and Asia and used this game-breaking weapon to massacre the primitive natives. Before the machine gun, Europeans couldn't just walk all over the natives. They had to compromise, slowly take over because, 50 spear-throwing natives could reasonably take out a guy with a musket. The machine gun made it so that a few hundred colonizers with machine guns could easily mow down tens of thousands of natives. Yeah, that's fun and all when you're cheesing noobs armed with sticks, but nobody wanted to even think of that terrifying scenario where the other side shoots back. This horror, and I do mean pure horror, was unleashed through World War I at the end of the 20th century. Quick recap. While Britain and France were smurfing natives on the other side of the world, the Prussians finally managed to unite Germany and become an actual force to be reckoned with. Germany formed the Triple Alliance with Austria, Hungary, and Italy, while Britain formed the Triple Entente with France and Russia as tense opposition. This powder keg finally exploded when Archduke Ferdinand of Austria got assassinated by Slavic nationalists. World War I, the war to end all war, just started, and it was a whole new beast that humanity could never have dreamed of. Terrifying weapons like machine guns and high explosives were pointed at each other, while barbed wire spread everywhere. Entire countries went all in for the war. They used everything in their power to maintain the front, to stack up casualties on the enemy, and really, not to die. The soldiers at the very front lines started to adapt and did the logical thing. Dig holes in the ground for cover or get shot dead. Hiding your lower body in a ditch cuts the chances of getting shot by a bullet in half. Lurking in a hole in the ground was more resilient against bombardment than building something up. This defensive ditch is called a trench. The Western Front was a continuation of trenches which made up lines. The combination of barbed wire to apply the slow debuff and spraying anything that comes your way with a machine gun while hiding in a trench was an unbelievably OP defensive strat. Sure, but how do you prevent getting flanked? Just dig some more. The trenches extended along indefinitely across the entire battlefield, from the seas of Belgium to the Swiss Alps. The Western Front became a competition of digging. As you could probably guess, recklessly charging a trench is a quick way to unalive yourself. The wrong charge could Thanos snap literal thousands of people in seconds. This is why other creative, ruthless, and desperate methods were deployed against trenches like mass bombardment and poison gas. The land between the opposing trenches was cursed. Constant bombardment evaporated the last tree, and only shell holes and corpses remained. This land, stretching anywhere between tens to hundreds of meters or yards, whatever, was completely laid to waste. This land was known as No Man's Land. Breaching the enemy trench was pretty straightforward. You would bombard the fuck out of it, forcing the enemy to move their machine guns. Before they could set it up again, you would have to charge through No Man's Land and jump into the enemy trench where machine guns couldn't be used without friendly fire trolling, and chaotic, close quarters, tooth and nail combat would break out. If you managed to kill every enemy inside, and that's a big if, you would immediately then switch to defense mode and try to stop a wave of enemy reinforcements from their second line of defense. The breach would only be successful if you managed to survive that onslaught as well. There were hundreds of these trenches across the Western Front. Millions of young men died as this miserable war of attrition raged on with no end in sight. Literal hell on earth was breaking loose here in the trenches. The worst part of trench warfare was the disgusting environment. Trenches would get flooded whenever it rained, and soldiers had no choice but to witness their feet literally rot away in their boots, a symptom aptly named trench foot. Fleas and lice were breeding like crazy, and even sacred sleep was impossible because of the mosquitoes. But the smell, oh god, the smell! You were forced to sleep next to your dead, rotting brother in arms because there was no way to even give him the dignity of a proper burial without getting shot yourself. Perhaps a warm dinner would have made things even slightly better, but that's a luxury nobody could afford. The enemy would bombard any sign of smoke straight to hell, forcing the miserable soldiers to eat stale, cold, and disgusting meals. The culminating point was anticlimactically reached for German aggression during World War I. With the British sealing off the seas, supplies were running short. Both sides said, fuck it, and focused on throwing everything they had at the other side for the sole purpose of inflicting as much pain as humanly possible. After all, the war will have to end if the other side ran out of living bodies first. Germany's master plan was to quickly overrun the French fortress Verdun, beef up its defenses, and then just hang in there while mowing down the French onslaught until the war ended. However, the outnumbered Frenchmen at Verdun understandably didn't like that story all too much and desperately defended with their only possible option: drag it out in the trenches. From February of 1916 to the end of that year, a combined 1 million soldiers from both sides died in the trenches. That July, while the Germans were trapped in the trenches of Verdun, Britain started its massive counterattack. I mean, what better time to break through the German triple defense lines around the Somme River? Britain bombed the German trenches for 8 days straight before epically charging in. Alas, the Germans weren't stupid, and already changed up their tactics to defense mode. Remember how I said that you could literally Thanos snap thousands of soldiers if you carelessly charged in? Well, Britain lost about 60,000 good men that day, signaling the start of a meat grinder battle that would consume 1.1 million men over the next 4 months. Sure, but did you win, son? They managed to push the Germans back 10 kilometers or 6 miles. This roughly translated to 100 dead soldiers for every meter taken, and the distance from Paris to Berlin was 877 kilometers. The next year, 1917, 400,000 souls perished around the trenches of the Aisne, only to be one-upped by the 600,000 casualties accumulated in 1918 during Germany's final push. The horror of trench warfare continued until Germany could no longer sustain such losses. This was slaughter on an unprecedented scale for humanity, and everybody did their absolute best to come up with creative new weapons to not deal with trench warfare. Planes, mostly used for scouting until then, were transformed into flying death, immune from the trenches, and spawned the Air Force we know today. Tanks immune to machine gun fire and barbed wire, and most importantly, those goddamn trenches were developed so that humanity would never have to deal with trench warfare ever again. Have you ever wondered why the European powers just kept letting Hitler get away with shit through the appeasement strategy? Well, that was because everybody was shell-shocked by the horrors of the trenches and did not want to go through that again under any circumstances. And to be fair, trench warfare in particular didn't contribute that much to the tragedy of World War II. Unfortunately, we're dragged back into the nightmares of trench warfare again in the 21st century in Ukraine. Yes, tanks were able to bust through trenches, but technology advanced to the point where javelin missiles would bust through a tank, equalizing the field straight back to the trenches of World War I a century later, proving that war never changes.